So the next review here in my Halloween lineup is Silent Hill Homecoming, which I actually mentioned a little bit in my last review of Condemned Criminal Origin. Now, one thing I want to mention before I even begin on the game is the developers themselves. Ever since Silent Hill moved out of Japan, the series has been going down a downward spiral. And what do you know? Surprise, surprise. The studios that Silent Hill has moved to since it left Japan have all been American developers. And let me just say one thing about American horror versus Japanese horror. American horror usually consists of one or two things. A main character straps a chainsaw onto his arm and runs through legions of the undead, slaughtering millions as he makes his way towards, I don't know, I guess two-dimensional love interest and a, uninspired ending with a total lack of closure. The only other kind of horror that America seems generally capable of doing is something along the lines of a slasher flick. And granted, there have been a few, good slasher flicks out there, but a lot of them just consist of Friday the 13th type deals where you have a two-dimensional character like Jason Voorhees with no real, background given, very little information as to why he's killing, and, as the series goes on, it's just the same thing over and over and over. Guy with a machete and a hockey mask kills teenagers who shouldn't be there anyway. Teenagers don't see it coming. Teenagers are picked off one by one after they have brilliant ideas like splitting up and going off. And it's always the same thing in the sense that the blonde decides to go take a shower and Jason kills her first because I guess he had a traumatic experience as a child with blondes and showers. Or actually, that's kind of weird. I need to think about that. Yeah, I thought about that last statement. Still doesn't make much sense, actually, thinking about it and further. I need more time to think about it. Yeah, still doesn't make sense. But anyway, what I was going to say is that Americans in the past have made good horror. Some American movie studios have made really notable movies, especially of the independent variety, like, Paranormal Activity and The Shining. But I am saying generally Americans just don't seem all that capable, at least when compared to the Japanese. See, the thing about Japanese horror that makes it better than American horror is that it's not as physical. In American horror, they'll usually show some guy with a knife running around killing people and then expect you to feel, fear towards that. But that's the thing. In Japanese horror, it seems to be a lot more slow building and oppressive, where they want to build up more suspense, so when you finally do see what it is you're supposed to be scared of, it always does feel a bit stronger, even if, it's not that scary in itself. Also, Japanese seem to have the idea that the less you see of something, the scarier it is, whereas Americans just like to have whatever's supposed to be scaring you up close and personal the whole time. Well, what do you know, 2 minutes, 30 seconds in, and I actually haven't even talked about the game yet. Although, really, after all I said about American horror, and, how inferior it is to the Japanese horror, and how I mentioned that Silent Hill Homecoming has an American developer, I mean, it's pretty obvious what I'm probably going to say about the game. That being that Silent Hill Homecoming's most crippling flaw is that fundamentally it just isn't that scary. First off is the story, and the biggest flaw I have with the story is that it's trying as hard as it can in every single sense to be like Silent Hill 2. Actually, let me rephrase that. The game is not trying to be like Silent Hill 2. It is trying to be Silent Hill 2 in every sense of the term. Here are 3 ways alone it tries to be like Silent Hill 2. Number 1, it has Pyramid Head in it. Number 2, the story revolves around the main character trying to find a loved one. And number 3, eventually the town of Silent Hill in some way, shape, or form gets involved, and by that I mean the main character goes there, fights a bunch of monsters, and then finds some hidden past element of his past which he suppressed. So basically every single plot twist in some way, shape, or form seems to have its roots from Silent Hill 2. Which, in itself might be fine if they took, the things that they did in Silent Hill 2 and experimented with them, but there's just so little change from Silent Hill 2 that the ending, which is supposed to be some big giant twist, just comes off as extremely obvious. You know what? I take that last statement back. I think that Silent Hill Homecoming should be trying harder to be like Silent Hill 2, because here's 2 things Silent Hill 2 has that Homecoming does not. Number 1, it tells a really great story, and number 2, it's genuinely scary. Here's one thing right off the bat. The characters in Silent Hill 2 were a lot better than they are in Homecoming, because each character actually was fleshed out and they seemed to have their own motivations and characterization and personality, whereas in Silent Hill Homecoming, I think they're just there because the American developers couldn't think of anything better. Like, for instance, the 2 characters that you have with you the majority of the time is a wisecracking black sidekick and a love interest whose subplot seems to be shoehorned into every single situation the developers could think of. However, in Silent Hill 2, all the characters seem to have their own purpose and, really important part to the plot. If you were to remove some of the characters in Silent Hill Homecoming, it would have little to no effect on the major story as a whole, whereas in Silent Hill 2, every single supporting character does contribute something to the overarching plot. Next up is the combat, and a lot of people have spent time talking about all the reasons they hate the combat in Silent Hill Homecoming, but really, bad combat in Silent Hill is actually kind of a staple, and you can't use the excuse, well, the earlier games had bad combat on purpose. No, that's not true. Silent Hill's just one of those games that has naturally bad combat. But here's the thing, though. In the earlier Silent Hill games, it was apparent that the main characters were respectively a writer, a clerk, a teenage girl, and just some loser who lives in his apartment all day. But in Silent Hill Homecoming, you're playing as a former soldier, so you'd expect the combat to be, better. Unfortunately, there's a little problem with the combat, and that's that it isn't better at all. See, to try to balance out the combat, the developers tried to implement a block move, which you could use to evade enemy attacks, which, on pencil and paper, would actually fit pretty well into a Silent Hill game, because, the whole, thing about the whole survival horror thing is that you're in itself not supposed to stand a very big chance against the enemies that you're fighting. The ultimate problem with this is that the dodge roll, block, evade thing does not work in the slightest. I mean, you have to get your timing just right, and even then, your character's probably going to be hit anyway because, an enemy swiped you mid-animation and you rolled in the wrong direction or whatever. See, in a game like Kingdom Hearts, whenever you press, the dodge button, you're actually invincible during the animation, whereas in Silent Hill Homecoming, if someone hits you while you're dodging, it still counts as hitting you, and then you fall flat on your ass and lay there for a few seconds. But it's as I said, you can't really criticize a Silent Hill game for bad combat, and let's be honest here, the bad combat does make the game feel a bit more, hectic and frenzied, which, to the horror elements, I guess that does make the game a bit scarier in the long run. So fine, I won't rag on Silent Hill Homecoming's combat too much, except for the dodge function. I'm sorry, but if you want to put a dodge function in a game, make sure it works. Otherwise, it's not worthwhile at all. Because even though the combat was bad in the earlier Silent Hill games, at least it worked. And the dodge button does not work. That's the thing. It's like it's left there just to taunt you. It's like, hey, you want to dodge the attack? Oh, you dodged it. That's too bad. Hey, you want to dodge this next one? Oh, it didn't work either. Hee hee hee. Actually, in retrospect, that little imitation I did of the dodge button might have actually been a bit too close to realistic. Yeah, moving on. So, visuals. Well, if nothing else, at least Silent Hill Homecoming looks nice. I mean, the characters are all animated well, and the locations are really good, actually. But the one problem that I have with the visuals is the character designs, and more specifically, the enemy designs. I mean, in Silent Hill 2, all the enemies seem to have some slight, effeminate undertones, which kind of, gave the impression that they're kind of birthed from, some of James's trauma and are related to his deceased wife in some way. But, in Silent Hill Homecoming, where the whole plot is looking for your little brother, the enemies seem to have no relation to that. It's like, the American developers just drew doodles for a few hours and picked their favorites and then animated those into the game. I'd also like to add that I'm thoroughly disappointed with the sound. All the earlier Silent Hill games, no, not just Silent Hill 2 in this regard, used a lot of interesting sound effects, Like, Silent Hill Homecoming's music consists of pretty much a generic, kind of rockish music, maybe with a guitar, drum set, piano, all that generic stuff. Whereas the earlier Silent Hills tried a lot of different instruments and musical styles. Usually they'd use, things like a banjo. Like, who's heard of a banjo in a horror game? Well, I don't know, I guess the Japanese developers did, and you know what? The game was better for it. And since Silent Hill Homecoming's music is so disappointing, like, in itself it wouldn't be that big a deal, but when you hold it up against the older game's music, it just comes off as a disappointment in the long run. And last but not least, Silent Hill Homecoming just isn't that scary when you hold it up to the older games. There's just something about it. Maybe it's because it doesn't tread any new ground. Maybe it's because the mechanics are more annoying than they are frightening to enhance the experience. I don't quite know what it is, but the game just doesn't hold a candle up to its predecessors in the horror department. And the trickiest thing about this game is I don't really know who I'd recommend it to. The people who like action games will hate the game because it makes you feel underpowered the whole time. However, the longtime survival horror fans will also hate the game because it feels too much like an action game. It's like the game tried to have its cake and eat it too, and when it comes to a game like this, you can't really do it. When Silent Hill 2 came out, we all knew who it was trying to appeal to. It was trying to appeal to the people who wanted a scary game. Here, it's like Silent Hill Homecoming's trying to appeal to everybody. And as I just said, that just fundamentally won't work with something like this. Well, okay, actually, one game comes to mind that did it right. In fact, looking back on it, I wonder what game Silent Hill Homecoming tried so hard to copy that it kind of based itself around the concept of. Oh yeah, Resident Evil 4. And here's another problem I have with Silent Hill Homecoming. Why does it try to copy Resident Evil 4 in so many respects? Resident Evil 4 was a good game. I'm glad we're all in agreement there. But Silent Hill and Resident Evil, in my mind, were always on opposite ends of a spectrum. Resident Evil always represented a physical kind of horror, whereas Silent Hill was about the psychological kind. So, in short, I don't like Silent Hill Homecoming because it's not consistent, and I really don't recommend it to a longtime Silent Hill fan or someone who wants a good action game. I only recommend it to someone if they're really desperately in need of a survival horror experience, no matter how bad it is.